A common criticism of the European Union is that it doesn't respect parliamentary rights. It's rather an arena of executive and maybe organized interest groups. But as we also know, while 20 years ago this criticism would maybe have been uncontroversial, today the picture is somewhat more complicated. The European Parliament has become a powerful legislator, and also many national parliaments have created new rights and new capacities that help them to control their government's European policy. This presentation will be about the side of the national parliaments. It's about how and more importantly about why they respond to European integration. And the idea why these questions have been asked for quite a while in the literature is that we want to know a bit more than just the idea that the constraints of European integration undermine national democracy. We also want to know which domestic factors or what kind of actors have the ability to implement reforms that would make EU policy making more democratic in the member states. And the central argument and the findings that I present here suggest that the national party elites in the parliaments have quite a strong influence on how their institutions adapt to the demands of European integration. But let's start with how parliaments respond. So what they do is they create rights, such as information rights, that help them to know and possibly influence their government's participation in European negotiations. They create these rights when they join the EU, and they possibly change these rights when the European Union changes. And they can be stronger or they can be weaker. So we can follow a country such as Portugal, which created relatively weak rights when it joined. It didn't respond very strongly to the Treaty on European Union and the Amsterdam Treaty on the Treaty of Nice. It reacted a little bit more in the aftermath of the Constitutional Treaty, and this scale ends in late 2010. Until then, it had not yet reacted significantly to the Treaty of Lisbon. So this is the kind of path that parliaments can take, but of course some are better than others. So you have the Danish parliament here, which consistently throughout the 1990s and 2000s has had stronger EU-related privileges than Portugal. And in this way you can align all the other member state parliaments and their responses to different European treaties and to their enlargement. And you see that there is at any given point in time in the Union quite a big difference. So the kind of parliamentary deficits that you see depends to a considerable extent on where you stand. Now, why is that? Now, we can think that many governments and parties in the member states will normally promote giving competences to the European Union because they think that in this way they can address common policy problems better than alone. But these kind of decisions to give authority to the European Union usually generate follow-up problems over how competences should now be distributed between institutions. And one type of conflict that also emerges is what kind of democratic institutions should obtain rights over EU policy making. And in making these choices, the so-called constitutional ideas, the visions of how to design the EU, of governments and of parliamentary parties become very important. And among other things, parties disagree on what kind of democracy the European Union needs. And to put things slightly more simple than they are, in some countries, the most important parties think of European democracy as a parliamentary democracy at the European level with a powerful parliament, and in other countries they have a stronger intergovernmental vision of European democracy where the national parliaments are the central sources of legitimacy. And these ideas matter for how different countries react to integration. In those countries where parties favor the European Parliament, they welcome its empowerment, and they see less of a need for institutional reforms of national parliamentary rights. In those countries where the European Parliament is rather another supranational institution, which takes away power from the governments and which lacks democratic legitimacy, the national parties instead react with emphasizing the rights of national parliaments, using institutional reforms to give them more authority. And this is how national parliamentary reforms enter the domestic agenda and the domestic reform discussion. Here, party elites are really decisive. Of course, when this happens, then other factors come into play as well. So when the question of institutional reform enters the domestic agenda, then it also gets picked up by Eurosceptic parliamentarians and also by Eurosceptic voters. Yeah? People who normally put most of their emphasis on the question of membership and of preventing further loss of national competences. Yeah, these actors connect their opposition to integration to demands for far-reaching powers of the national parliaments. And also domestic reformers typically run into constraints that have to do with the existing organization of the national political system. So, for instance, those who demand far-reaching reforms might face opposition, for instance, by governments against such measures that undermine the privileges that were previously distributed. So governments might want to prevent reforms that move out of the normal organization of domestic politics. We can test these arguments, for instance, by trying to understand which factors make it more or less likely that we see a response to a change in European treaties in national parliaments. And when you do that, this is one of the things you find. Yeah, in fact, the most important impact is whether national parliamentary parties oppose or support the powers of the European Parliament. And on this side of the scale, where parliamentary parties on average have skeptical views of the European Parliament, you have 3 times higher a chance that we see a domestic reform than in the parliaments where most MPs are heavily supportive of the European Parliament. Some other factors play a role as well here, for instance, how many powers the parliaments already have and so on, but this is the most important substantial effect. What you can also do, however, look at those reforms that then happen and see which are more far-reaching than others. And here's one of the findings. You see that those parliaments, for instance, which already have a strong committee system, tend to implement the most far-reaching reforms. Those parliaments which lack strong rights in the first place will also react at best very weakly to European integration. And you find a similar pattern when you look at Euroscepticism. I'm not going to show this here. So let me conclude what we learned from this. I think 2 points. The first one, as I emphasized, is that European integration is not simply a structural constraint that undermines national parliamentary democracy. It also depends on the political elites of the member states and what they envision for the European polity. And if they think a national parliament plays an important role for the legitimacy of the political system, they in fact have quite a lot of power over institutional reform. But having said this, we are in all likelihood going to see that asymmetries between the rights of different member parliaments will be here to stay. And this is because the kind of factors that shape different responses are known to be relatively stable over time. So support for the European Parliament is rooted in party ideology. Euroscepticism is to a large extent rooted in the identities of individuals. And domestic institutions are rooted in norms that have evolved in the domestic political systems. And for as long as these factors don't change, we will also continue to see differences between the rights of the member parliaments. Thank you very much.